Life has a way of making you feel like you've got everything figured out, only for it to hit you with a cold slap of reality when you least expect it. That's what happened to me, but let me start at the beginning. I was never a guy to fall for illusions. I was raised by a single mother who taught me the value of hard work, loyalty, and respect. She told me, life will throw you all kinds of punches, but it's not about how hard it hits, it's about how you stand back up. I lived by those words. I had my career on track, friends who respected me, and a wife who I thought was my world. Sarah. She was my high school sweetheart. We met when I was 17, and she was this perfect, bright-eyed girl who seemed to have everything figured out. She was everything I thought I wanted. Beautiful, intelligent, supportive. Our relationship had always been solid, or so I thought. We got married young, a little over 5 years ago, but it felt like we were destined for each other. We didn't have the perfect marriage. No one does. But I always believed that love could overcome anything, that honesty and communication would keep us connected. And for the most part, I thought that was true. Then there was my godfather, Thomas. He was like a father figure to me after my dad passed away when I was 13. Thomas was a well-established man, older, wiser, respected by everyone who knew him. He had a certain magnetism, a presence that made people feel like they were important when he spoke to them. His life was everything I aspired to be, successful, confident, powerful. And yet, despite his many accomplishments, he was always there for me, like an older brother, sometimes more like a mentor. Sarah loved him too, almost like a second father. Over the years, she and Thomas grew close, though I always thought it was just out of mutual respect and admiration. Thomas often took me aside to give me advice, to teach me the ropes of being a man in this world. And for the longest time, I felt lucky to have him in my life. But that would all change. I had no reason to doubt either of them. Both Sarah and Thomas had been pillars in my life, people I trusted implicitly. And yet, looking back, there were small moments, tiny, almost unnoticeable things that I never paid attention to. It was the way Thomas would look at Sarah sometimes, or the way Sarah would get just a little too quiet when he left the room. It's funny, isn't it? How we can ignore the signs we don't want to see. How we convince ourselves that we're just being paranoid, or that these things don't mean anything. But deep down, I had always felt this sense of something being off. It wasn't until the summer after our 5th anniversary that I began to feel something shift between Sarah and me. Up until then, everything had seemed as normal as it could be in a busy marriage. We had our routine, we had our fights, but we always made up. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. But that summer, that's when things started to unravel. It started small, a late night here and there where Sarah would stay out a little longer than usual. She'd be vague about where she'd been. I'd ask, and she'd give me some excuse about hanging out with friends or running errands. At first, I told myself it was nothing. People need space. It wasn't like we were in a toxic relationship where we couldn't do things without the other person being up in their business. But the longer it went on, the more I noticed something wasn't right. She'd come home a little too distant, a little too tired, and the way she'd look at her phone, it was almost like she was hiding something. One night, I decided to confront her about it. We were sitting on the couch, watching a show, and I just blurted it out. Sarah, are you okay? You've been acting a little distant lately. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I feel like something's off. She turned to me, eyes wide with surprise, almost like I'd slapped her in the face. For a split second, I could see a flash of panic in her eyes, just a brief flicker, but it was there. Then, she quickly recovered, plastering on a smile. Everything's fine, she said, a little too quickly. You're just imagining things. I nodded, forcing a smile myself, even though my gut was screaming at me. It wasn't like her to get defensive like that. Sarah had always been open with me about everything, even when it was hard. But now she was shutting down. For the next few days, things were tense. I could feel the walls building up between us, and I hated it. I didn't know what to do with it. So, I tried to keep busy. I threw myself into my work, hung out with friends, did whatever I could to distract myself from the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake it. Then one night, it all came crashing down. I had just gotten back from a business trip, Sarah wasn't home when I walked in, which wasn't unusual. She'd been spending more time at her sister's house, apparently helping her with something, but I didn't think much of it. I set my bag down, kicked off my shoes, and headed to the kitchen. That's when I saw it. The one thing that made my blood run cold. On the counter, next to the mail, was her phone. It wasn't like Sarah to leave her phone lying around. She was always glued to it, checking texts, social media, whatever. But tonight, it was just sitting there, screen face up. Something in me snapped. I don't know what exactly made me do it, but I picked it up. I told myself I wasn't going to snoop, that I'd just put it back and wait for her to come home. But before I could stop myself, my thumb swiped across the screen, unlocking it. I immediately regretted it. There, sitting in her text messages, was a conversation that made my heart stop. It was from Thomas. The first message was innocuous enough, just a casual, "How's your day going?" But as I scrolled up, I saw more. The messages started getting more intimate, more flirtatious. Thomas was sending her heart emojis. She was responding with hugs and kisses, and "I miss you." It felt like I was looking at something that wasn't meant for my eyes. Then I saw it. A message from Sarah, sent 2 days ago. "I can't stop thinking about you. I'm sorry, but I can't help how I feel." My stomach dropped. I felt lightheaded, like the room was spinning. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stared at the screen, rereading the words. I couldn't believe it. I refused to believe it. I knew what it meant. I didn't need any more evidence. But there it was, laid out in front of me. My wife, my partner, my best friend. She was having an affair. With Thomas, my godfather. The man who had always been there for me, who had mentored me, who I had looked up to like a father. It didn't make sense. Thomas was more than just a mentor to me. He was my family. He was supposed to be a figure of trust, someone I could rely on no matter what. How could he do this? And why? What had gone wrong between Sarah and me? I could feel the rage bubbling up inside me. My first instinct was to confront them, to go straight to Thomas and demand an explanation. But then, something inside me told me to hold off. I had to think. I had to be smart. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. Instead, I set the phone down carefully on the counter, as if nothing had changed. I couldn't let Sarah know I had seen the messages yet. I needed to process this first. I needed to figure out my next move. But as I stood there, trying to calm myself, the reality of it hit me. The woman I loved, who I thought I knew better than anyone, had betrayed me. She had crossed a line I never thought possible. And Thomas had betrayed me too, in the most unforgivable way. I didn't know it then, but that moment would mark the beginning of something much darker. Something that would forever change the man I was. I wasn't going to let this slide. I wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. There would be consequences. But first, I had to let Sarah explain. I needed to hear her lie to my face. I needed to know just how far they'd gone. The silence in the house felt oppressive, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept replaying the messages over and over again, as if my brain was trying to come to terms with what I had just discovered. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let this go. Not like this. Not without a reckoning. When Sarah finally came home that night, I was sitting in the living room, trying to keep my composure. I had told myself I wouldn't confront her right away. I would wait for the right moment. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized that the moment would never come. I had to take control. I had to face the truth. She walked in, her face lighting up when she saw me. "Hey, babe, you're back early," she said, putting her purse down on the counter. "Yeah," I replied, my voice low. "I wanted to talk to you." Sarah froze. Something about my tone made her stop in her tracks. She glanced over at me, trying to read my expression. But I kept my face neutral, my eyes cold. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice suddenly tinged with concern. I stood up slowly, making sure I had her full attention. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I knew I had all the power in this moment. "I know," I said flatly. "I know about you and Thomas." The blood drained from Sarah's face. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked at me like I just struck her. For a moment, we just stood there, locked in a battle of wills, neither of us saying anything. Her eyes were wide, the look of someone who had been caught in the worst kind of lie. I could see the panic slowly creeping in, but she was trying to mask it. It was almost like she didn't know how to respond, how to apologize, how to make it right. I felt a sick sense of satisfaction, like I had finally taken control of the situation. But I wasn't finished yet. No, this was just the beginning. How long? I asked, my voice calm but icy. How long has it been going on, Sarah? She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she reached up to push her hair behind her ears. I could tell she was trying to collect her thoughts, trying to come up with an explanation that would make everything go away. But I wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. It's not what you think, she stammered, looking anywhere but at me. Not what I think, I repeated, taking a step closer. You think I don't know what's been going on? You think I didn't see the texts? You think I didn't see how you've been acting, how you've been lying to me? How long, Sarah? Her eyes welled up with tears, and for a moment, I almost felt a flicker of pity for her. But that quickly disappeared as she opened her mouth to speak, her voice breaking. I never meant for it to happen, she whispered. It just did. I don't know how it happened, but it did. That's your excuse? I couldn't stop the anger from seeping into my voice. You didn't mean for it to happen? You think I'm just supposed to forgive you because you didn't plan this? I trusted you, Sarah. You were my partner. I gave you everything, and you betrayed me with him. With him. Her eyes darted to the floor, her lips quivering as she wiped at her tears. It wasn't like that, I swear. It wasn't intentional. Thomas, he's been there for me. He's always been there. And we got close, too close. Too close? I repeated, my voice getting louder now. You think that's the explanation? That because Thomas was always around, you could just sleep with him behind my back? This is my godfather we're talking about, Sarah. The man who I looked up to my whole life. And you threw it all away for what? A cheap affair? Sarah didn't answer. She just stood there, her face crumpled with guilt and shame. The silence between us felt suffocating, but I didn't care. I needed her to feel the weight of what she had done. I needed her to understand how badly she had hurt me, how she had shattered everything I thought I knew about love and trust. You're not going to lie to me anymore, Sarah, I said, my voice steady but cold. I want the truth. Everything. I want to know how long it's been going on. I want to know why. You owe me that much. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. I could see the internal struggle on her face, whether to admit everything or to try to lie her way out of it. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. It started about 6 months ago. We were just talking at first. Just talking. And then one night, he kissed me. And after that, we couldn't stop. We tried to stop, but we couldn't. I couldn't. It just felt right in a way. And I don't know why I did it. I was stupid, okay? I'm so sorry. Stupid. Sorry. Those were the words she used. But they meant nothing. They didn't change what had happened, what she had done. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I absorbed the full weight of her confession. 6 months. 6 months of betrayal, of lies, of hidden moments between her and the man I had trusted more than anyone else. 6 months of pretending everything was fine, when everything was slowly falling apart. But I wasn't going to let this be the end. I wasn't going to be the victim here. Not anymore. You've made your choice, Sarah, I said, my voice cold and final. You've chosen him over me. And I'm not going to stand here and beg for an explanation that I'll never get. I'm done with this. With you. Her face crumbled even further, and she took a step toward me, her voice pleading. No, please don't say that. We can fix this. We can work through it. I raised my hand, cutting her off. No, you've already worked through it, and I can't forgive you for what you've done. Not now. Not ever. I could see the shock on her face, the realization that she had lost me for good. And in that moment, a part of me almost felt sorry for her. But I couldn't afford to feel sorry anymore. Not when the betrayal ran this deep. As I turned to walk away, my heart felt like it was breaking in two, but there was a strange sense of clarity to it. This was over. I had no idea what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. Not without consequences. And as I left the room, I realized just how much I had changed in that moment. The man I was before was gone. The man I was becoming was someone who would not let this go unanswered. Not for me. Not for my dignity. Not for the lies. The next few days were a blur of anger, confusion, and disbelief. Sarah moved out, leaving our house with nothing but an apology that meant nothing. I didn't care where she went. She could go to Thomas for all I cared. But she wasn't the one I was focused on now. It was Thomas, the man who had been my mentor, my godfather, my trusted ally, the one who had not only betrayed me but had taken what was most sacred. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and I was done playing by the rules. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. No friends, no family. I kept it to myself because I didn't want sympathy, didn't want anyone to see me as the victim. I wasn't a victim. I was the man who had been wronged, and I was going to make sure both of them paid for what they had done. But there was a twist to this. I knew Thomas. I knew how he operated, how he thought. He wasn't some dumb guy who'd let things fall apart so easily. He'd think he could talk his way out of this, convince me that it was all some kind of mistake. But I wasn't interested in hearing his lies. I wasn't interested in anything he had to say. I took a deep breath and decided on my course of action. I wasn't going to let this end with them walking away unscathed. I would make sure that they both paid. I would make them feel the weight of their choices. The first step was setting up a meeting with Thomas. I called him the next morning, knowing that he wouldn't suspect anything. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey kid, what's up? You back in town already?" I could hear the familiar warmth in his voice, the same voice that had guided me through life. The one I had once trusted. "Yeah, I'm back. We need to talk. In person." There was a pause on the other end, just long enough for me to feel the shift in his tone. He wasn't used to hearing me speak like this. He didn't know the gravity of what had happened. "All right," he said, the casualness slipping from his voice. "Where?" "Same place as always," I replied. "Tonight. 7. "Okay, I'll see you then." I hung up the phone, feeling the weight of what I had just set in motion. The plan was simple. I would confront him, but not just about the affair. I had something else in mind. A lesson, if you will. He had stolen from me, and now it was my turn to take something from him. I spent the day preparing, making sure everything was in place. I knew that Thomas wouldn't be able to see this coming. He was too sure of himself, too comfortable in his own skin. But he wasn't as untouchable as he thought. Nobody was. As the clock ticked closer to 7, my mind was made up. I had no illusions about what was to come. It was time to turn the tables. I wasn't just going to confront him. I was going to destroy his world the way he had destroyed mine. And when he begged for forgiveness, when he realized the depth of his mistake, I would make sure he knew who was in control now. The game was on. I arrived at the old bar where Thomas and I used to meet up. It was a quiet, dimly lit place, one of those spots where people came to escape the world for a while. When Thomas had first introduced me to it, it had felt like a secret, a shared space just for us. A place where I could speak freely, learn from him, and feel like I was part of something greater. Now, it felt like the last place I would ever want to step foot in again. The air smelled of stale whiskey and wood, and the old leather seats creaked under the weight of memories I no longer cared to keep. But I knew this was where it had to happen. This was where I would put my plan into motion. I took a seat at the back, where we used to sit for our long talks. The booth was empty, and I let myself fall into the seat, my mind running through every detail, every word I would say to him. I wasn't sure if he knew I was coming, but the fact that he agreed to meet was enough for me. He wouldn't back down. He'd think he could talk his way out of this. And that's exactly why I was going to make sure that this time, he couldn't. At precisely 7:05, the door opened, and there he was. Thomas walked in with his usual confident stride, wearing that same suit I'd seen him in hundreds of times before. The kind of suit that said, "I'm in control," the kind of suit that made people believe he had the world at his feet. And for a long time, I had believed that too. But that was before everything came crashing down. His eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on me, I saw the faintest flicker of confusion cross his face. He was used to me being more casual, more laid back. He didn't expect me to be sitting here, waiting for him, with the look I knew I had now, the one that showed just how much I had changed. He approached the table slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to curiosity. As he sat down, he smiled that same knowing smile. "Hey kid, you look intense. What's going on?" I didn't respond right away. I just looked at him, my gaze steady, letting the silence hang in the air between us like a thick fog. He shifted uncomfortably under my stare, clearly not used to being the one who wasn't in control of a situation. For the first time since I'd known him, I could see a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Do you want a drink?" he asked, leaning back in his chair, trying to regain his composure. "No," I said, my voice sharp and deliberate. "I just want to talk. I'm done with the games." Thomas raised an eyebrow, then leaned forward, his tone changing. "Look, I don't know what you're upset about, but if this is about Sarah—" "Don't," I interrupted, cutting him off before he could finish. I could feel the anger rising in me again, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I know what's been going on. I know everything. About you and her." For a moment, Thomas didn't say anything. He just stared at me, as if trying to read me, trying to figure out if I was bluffing. But there was no bluff here. This was real. Finally, he spoke, his voice slightly more guarded. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, leaning forward, matching his intensity. "I know about the texts, the lies, the affair." Thomas's face tightened, and for the first time, he looked almost nervous. But he recovered quickly, regaining his usual self-assured demeanor. "I don't know where you're getting your information from," he said, voice steady now, "but you've got it all wrong. You're just jumping to conclusions." I chuckled, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was hollow, edged with bitterness. "You think I don't know what's been going on behind my back? You think I'm that stupid?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. He was trying to talk his way out of this, but I wasn't going to let him. Not this time. "You want to know how long it's been going on?" I said, my voice steady but full of rage. 6 months, Thomas. 6 months of lies. 6 months of betrayal. And now you're going to sit here and act like none of this matters. He didn't answer. He couldn't. There was nothing left to say. I sat back, letting the silence stretch between us. I could see him fidgeting, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. I had him right where I wanted him, but I needed more. I wasn't going to leave this meeting without getting everything I needed from him. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" I asked, my voice quiet but cutting. "You think you can just do whatever you want, that no one will ever know? That I would never find out?" Thomas looked down at his hands, his jaw tightening. He was starting to realize this wasn't a conversation he could control anymore. But he wasn't broken yet. Not completely. "I never meant to hurt you," he said, his voice suddenly softer. "You've always been like a son to me. I never wanted to betray you. It just happened." I shook my head slowly. "No, you chose this. Both of you did. And now, you're going to pay for it." I saw his eyes flicker. Was it guilt? Fear? I couldn't tell. But whatever it was, it didn't matter. He wasn't getting away with this. Not now. Not ever. Thomas sat back in his chair, his expression now a mixture of guilt and frustration. He had underestimated me. He had thought he could talk his way out of this, that his charm would smooth over the mess he'd made. But I wasn't some naive kid anymore. I wasn't the one who admired him from the sidelines, eager to learn and follow. No, I was the man who had been betrayed. And I was the one who would make sure he felt every ounce of that pain. I could see that he was beginning to understand the severity of the situation. He had lost control, and he knew it. But even with that flicker of fear in his eyes, he was still trying to hold on to his position, trying to cling to the illusion that he could still make this right. "You're angry," Thomas said, his voice almost pleading now. "I get that. I can see why you'd be upset. But this doesn't have to go any further. We can fix this. We can move on from it. Stop." I cut him off, my tone hard as steel. "This isn't something you can just fix. You can't just apologize your way out of this one. You ruined everything, Thomas. You ruined my marriage. You ruined my trust in you. And you did it all because you thought you could get away with it. That's not something that just goes away with a couple of words." For a moment, Thomas was silent. The confident, charismatic godfather I had once looked up to was gone. All that was left was the man who had betrayed his closest family member, the man who had made a choice and now had to deal with the consequences. "I'm sorry," he said, but this time his voice cracked slightly. "I didn't mean to hurt you. It was a mistake, a lapse in judgment." I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing. "A lapse in judgment? Do you hear yourself? This wasn't a mistake, Thomas. This was calculated. You knew exactly what you were doing every step of the way." He swallowed hard, his throat tight. The words he had said so easily just moments before now felt hollow, powerless. The man who had once seemed invincible was now small and desperate. But I couldn't let up. "Not yet. Do you think I'm going to just forgive you for this?" I asked, my voice colder now. "You've shattered everything we had. My marriage, my trust in you, my sense of self. And now you expect me to walk away and forget it?" He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing around the dimly lit room as if he could find some kind of escape in the shadows. But I wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. "No," I said flatly. "This goes beyond forgiveness. You don't get to just apologize and walk away. Not after what you've done. You're going to pay for this, Thomas. And I'm not talking about some petty revenge. I'm talking about real consequences." He looked at me then, truly looked at me for the first time since we'd started this conversation. I could see it in his eyes, the realization that I wasn't bluffing, that I wasn't just some naive kid anymore, that I had the power to destroy everything he had worked so hard for. "You don't want to go down this road," Thomas said, his voice low, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "You think you're the first person who's ever been betrayed? The first to be hurt? You think this is going to make you feel better?" I didn't flinch. "No, but it's going to make sure you never forget what you did to me. And that, Thomas, is what you deserve." For the first time, there was no arrogance in his voice. There was no confident smirk. There was just a man who had been caught in his own web, a man who had crossed the line, and who now had to deal with the fallout. I wasn't going to let him weasel his way out of this, not by appealing to my old respect for him. He had taken that from me when he made his choice. Now it was time for him to learn the real cost of betrayal. "Where's Sarah?" I asked quietly, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. His face faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, his lips pressing into a thin line. "She's not here." I know she's with you," I interrupted, "and I want you both to understand something. You won't get away with this. Not by running, not by hiding. You'll never be able to forget what you've done. I'm going to make sure of that." There was no turning back now. The game had changed. And now, it was my turn to make sure they both paid for the mess they'd created. The next few days felt like a war, one fought in silence, with no more words exchanged between Thomas and me. He didn't call. Sarah didn't call. I didn't know if they were trying to regroup, or if they thought that avoiding me would somehow make things go away. But that was never going to happen. I had made up my mind, and now I had to follow through. I kept myself busy. Work helped, but more than that, I made sure to plan my next moves carefully. I couldn't afford to be impulsive now, even though every part of me wanted to burn everything to the ground. I had to be smart about this. But the first move was simple. I had to make sure that I destroyed Thomas's carefully crafted image. I couldn't let him walk away from this unscathed, thinking he could somehow brush it under the rug. So I started gathering information. I had friends in the business world, contacts who could dig up dirt on anyone if they were paid well enough. And Thomas? He had enemies. Enemies who were more than happy to help me with this. It didn't take long to dig up the first few cracks in his polished facade. Thomas was involved in shady investments. He had used his influence to push deals through that, on paper, were legitimate but had some very questionable financial backers. There were whispers of corruption, of dirty deals with people I had never heard of but knew enough to make my skin crawl. This wasn't just a man who had betrayed me. It was a man who had been hiding behind layers of lies for years. I smiled as I read through the documents. I knew exactly where this was going, and I would make sure it all came to light. It was late one night when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I picked it up anyway. It was Sarah. I hadn't spoken to her since the night I confronted her and Thomas. In a way, I had expected her to reach out sooner, but part of me had hoped that she wouldn't. I wasn't interested in her excuses. I didn't care for her apologies anymore. The trust was gone. The love was gone. But I answered anyway. What do you want? There was a long pause, and then I heard her voice, a little shaky, but still familiar. I need to see you. Can we talk? I felt a knot form in my stomach. It was exactly what I had been waiting for. A chance to finally make her feel what I had felt, the betrayal, the hurt. But I knew I wasn't ready to hear her spin her story. Not yet. You've got nothing left to say to me, I replied coldly. No, please, she begged. Just hear me out. Why now? I asked. You couldn't even be honest with me when it mattered. Now you want to talk? Why? To make yourself feel better? To explain your lies? I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I swear. I could hear the tears in her voice, but I wasn't moved. She had made her choice. And so had I. It's too late for apologies, Sarah. You made your bed. With that, I hung up, the finality of it echoing in my mind. She had lost her chance. But the silence between us wasn't a relief. It only made me more determined to take the next step. The war was only just beginning. The following week, I received an anonymous tip. A man named Daniel, one of Thomas's business partners, had been the one leaking information about his shady dealings. I didn't hesitate. I reached out to Daniel, meeting him in a nondescript cafe on the outskirts of town. He wasn't hard to find. A few $100 and a couple of well-placed questions, and I had him sitting across from me, looking nervous and eager to spill everything he knew. Thomas has been covering his tracks for years, Daniel told me in a hushed tone, but he's not as untouchable as he thinks. I've seen the numbers. I've seen the files. I didn't need to hear much more. I already had the leverage I needed. I thanked him, and as he left, I knew exactly how I would use this information. A week later, I had everything I needed to begin dismantling Thomas's empire. I made sure to leak the information about his questionable investments to the press. It wasn't just some petty revenge, it was a calculated move. If I couldn't have justice, I would make sure that Thomas lost everything. His reputation, his influence, his ability to make a living. And when the storm broke, it would be a reminder of who had put it all into motion. The next few days were a blur of news headlines, rumors, and whispered conversations. The articles about Thomas's shady deals hit the papers like a bombshell, and the press didn't let up. Stories about fraudulent investments, money laundering, and connections to dangerous people filled every outlet. It didn't take long for the public to start questioning his entire career. Meanwhile, Sarah was left in the dark. She had no idea that I had been the one to push the information into the public eye. I could feel her scrambling. I could almost hear her voice on the other end of the phone, asking Thomas why everything was falling apart. But by then, it was too late. Thomas had tried to keep his cool, but the pressure was mounting. The board of directors from his companies were demanding answers. His investors were pulling out. And as I sat back, watching everything unfold, I couldn't help but feel a twisted satisfaction. But it wasn't enough. Not yet wasn't long before Sarah came to me. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot from crying. She stood at my door, her hands shaking as she knocked. I had expected this, but even though I had prepared myself for it, it still felt strange to see her like this, broken, vulnerable, nothing like the woman I had once trusted. I don't know what to do, she said, her voice cracking. Everything is falling apart. Thomas, he's losing everything, and it's all my fault. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. You think I don't know that? She looked at me then, truly looked at me. For the first time since all of this started, the guilt in her eyes was palpable, but it didn't matter. Do you think this is going to make me feel sorry for you? I asked, my voice sharp. Do you think you can just walk back in and everything will be fine? I never meant to hurt you, she whispered. I was confused and I thought you wouldn't understand. You were never confused, Sarah, I said, shaking my head. You just didn't care. And neither did he. With that, I slammed the door in her face. There was nothing left to say. The pressure on Thomas grew unbearable. He was losing everything. His businesses, his reputation, his connections. And as the walls closed in, I could see the cracks in his armor. He tried to reach out to me again, but this time I didn't answer. But there was one thing he hadn't counted on: the sheer force of my anger. He had never seen this side of me before. This was the man who had been pushed too far, the man who had lost everything and was determined to make sure that no one else would ever betray him the way he had been betrayed. And now, as Thomas's empire crumbled, I couldn't help but wonder, was it all worth it? Was it worth watching them both lose everything? I had one last move to make. The final blow to Thomas's legacy. I made sure to get the last pieces of incriminating evidence, the ones that would tie him to illegal activities beyond just the business dealings. I handed them over to the authorities. It wasn't just about destroying his reputation anymore. It was about making sure he paid for his actions. By the time the investigation began, Thomas's world had already crumbled. It didn't take long for the consequences to catch up with Sarah. Her career, her social life, everything she had taken for granted fell apart. She was ostracized, her reputation forever linked to Thomas's scandal. But as I watched her life implode, I felt nothing. I had learned that revenge wasn't about satisfaction. It was about ensuring that no one ever disrespected you the way they had. Months later, I stood at the ruins of everything I had once believed in. My marriage was over. My godfather was in prison. And Sarah, well, she was nowhere to be found. But there was one thing I had learned. You can't control who betrays you, but you can control how you respond. And in the end, I had made them pay for everything they had done. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. And while I couldn't say I was happy, I knew I would never make the same mistake again.